In fact, there was no reason to believe that animation would follow the hand-drawn template. It could have gone in any direction. There was all types of animation.
You had stop-motion things like puppet films, but you also had live-action films that used stop-motion objects.
The thing about early cinema is they didn't have the computer-generated special effects that we have today, or even they didn't even use back screens. So these guys had to achieve this somehow, visually. A lot of times, to achieve a visual gag, especially comedy films, incorporated animation. And the earliest one I've seen is the Mack Sennett-produced Keystone film titled The Bowling Match. Where you see Ford Sterling, who's a braggart, and to have revenge on him, they set up some contrived electronic device, and when he throws the ball, they cut to the animation of the ball chasing the pins around. There's all kinds of early movie effects.
And then you had the experimental art films, where people were using cutouts and other little techniques that did show in theaters.
Well, certainly in somebody like Emile Cole, for instance, he used various forms to create a fantastical stream of consciousness effect. And the British pioneer, Walter R. Booth, even brought hand puppets into the mix.
In Europe, they were using similar techniques, but mostly for abstract films. My favorite, I think, was an entomologist, actually, from Russia, named Starovich, who animated bugs. At first, actually, he tried to use real bugs and animate those by photographing them one after another, and they didn't cooperate, I guess, too well. So he created these, I guess you'd call them puppets, because they're man-made constructions, but they look exactly like the insects. And these elaborate stories, he was, unlike some of the other Europeans working, he was into the story, and he had these great stories that he told through these animated bugs, and they look just beautiful.
The sense of social caricature is so strong because you have these bugs that are enacting an adulterous story, and a hypocritical one at that. You have Mr. and Mrs. Beetle, and she is unfaithful, and he gets very upset, except he's being unfaithful at the same time.
I'm more intrigued in the adult animation than stuff for kids. I mean, that was fantastic. The animation in that, with all the little beetles, and it was also, it kind of said something, an interesting message.
Willis O'Brien is another favorite of mine, partly because he made the first animated King Kong. But before that, he made shorts leading up to some of his fully rendered animated films. And there's no reason not to call them animated films, even though they were puppet. They were clearly puppets, but they were certainly animation.
O'Brien's was different because his type of animation was not stylized to the point. They were characters in a story rather than puppets for the sake of being animated puppets. I preferred the O'Brien technique. He always had a single figure that was jointed, and then you would manipulate it, and you could put character and so much more into it.
The animation industry, if it's to succeed, has to be part of the broader film industry. And in the teens, the industry was moving toward a format that called for a new feature film to be released every week.
Distributors had to send out a reel with novelties on it. They had to have probably a live-action short comedy, a news of the week, and a cartoon. They expected it every couple of weeks. You had to fulfill that, otherwise you couldn't be in business.
Winsor McCay didn't even conceive of the idea of the assembly line system that came to be the way animation was executed by most studios. So when J.R. Bray and Earl Hurd got involved with animation, they too had newspaper backgrounds, but they quickly came to understand the need for output, that you had to be able to turn these out on a regular basis if you were going to make any kind of living at animation.
By the mid-teens, you have animation starting to metamorphose into something that's more industrial. And that is facilitated by this patent of John Randolph Bray and Earl Hurd for the cell technology. In fact, it was one of those paradigm-shifting innovations. And essentially, the use of cells breaks the animation image into two elements, foreground and background.
So the peg system and cells were the two primary inventions that made it much easier to get these out faster, more quickly, with better fluidity. In fact, for a long time, for decades, everybody in animation was paying them a patent fee.
It must have been revolutionary to figure out that you could find a way to just draw the background once and have your character move across it through a piece of clear celluloid.
Bray and McKay were rivals, and McKay sued Bray for stealing his patent, and then Bray countersued McKay for stealing the patent. And this went on for years and years.
John Randolph Bray, around, I believe it's 1913, creates a character named Colonel He's a Liar. And Colonel He's a Liar becomes the first serial character, the first regularly appearing cartoon character in animation history. And Colonel He's a Liar was a diminutive man, some say inspired by Teddy Roosevelt.
He looks like Teddy Roosevelt, so that's what it came from. But when you see what the stories are and the movements, I mean, him playing baseball and what have you, it doesn't. There's no politics in the animation. So I tend to not think so. He does look like him if you just go on the face of it.
Colonel He's a Liar was a tall tale spinner caught up in outrageous situations. The inner titles on the films are usually rhyming couplets that tell Colonel He's a Liar's stories, and we see the outrageous tall tales acted out in animation. There were dozens and dozens of them, and as the series went on, sometimes stopped and started and went on, I think, for at least 10 years.
I really like Earl Hurd's Bobby Bumps cartoons. I think they're really ingenious and imaginative. And you see Earl Hurd playing with the medium itself, actually devising ideas that in some cases no one had ever thought of before.
In many of the Bobby Bumps cartoons, we see the hand of the artist, which I believe was Earl Hurd's hand, coming in and interacting and moving the characters around and being a kind of a god over Bobby Bumps and his dog.
He also thought of the same kind of thing that the Fleischers were doing with a little bit of live action, where he had Bobby, which was a cutout, sitting on the animator's hand as he was inking the animation drawing.
I know that was a leftover device from Winsor McKay, like, let's see how the artist creates animated drawings. And it was really, you know, a holdover from the public kind of needing to understand what they were about to watch.
Bobby Bumps Puts a Beanery on the Bum takes place in a restaurant where Bobby and his dog create all kinds of havoc, smashing dishes and so forth. And the intervening hand of the artist draws for them a ladder to escape the increasingly chaotic situation. In order to keep anybody from chasing Bobby Bumps and his dog up the ladder, the artist erases the bottom of the ladder. The cartoon ends with Bobby Bumps and his dog suspended in the middle of nowhere on this ladder, a kind of very existential and surreal ending for its time. I think these cartoons in many ways preceded the Fleischer and the Coco the Clown cartoons.
Animation was very, very closely tied to newspaper comic strips for about 5 or 6 years. And at that point, it was very much a newspaper-driven culture where everybody read like 9 newspapers a day and comic strips were very big. And it would make sense that early animation would have close ties with newspaper comic strips.
In 1913, Émile Cohl came to New York from France to direct The Newlyweds, which was based on George McManus's comic strip. That was very popular just for 1 year. And sadly, 1914, the whole lab caught fire, nitrate fire. Every negative was destroyed. There's only one of those that survived today, and that was because somebody had a print somewhere else that they preserved. But that was the first time they took a comic strip character and made a series out of it.
There's one very pragmatic and mundane reason why so many comic strip characters came to the screen, and the answer is William Randolph Hearst, because Hearst, the newspaper magnate, the publishing giant that he was, owned King Features Syndicate, which owned all of these popular comic strip characters. And Hearst was interested in movies right away, and he started a newsreel in the teens, and he also decided to start an animation studio. And if he was going to own an animation studio, it only made sense to use the characters he already owned as the stars.
The most noteworthy is probably a sequence of Crazy Cat cartoons. They really pale by comparison to the original George Harriman comic strip, which is brilliant and wild and surreal and graphically very interesting.
The drawing styles in all of these films aren't particularly ambitious. They were by the number, factory assembly line cartoons. Some were forgettable, some were amusing.
I was pretty much disappointed most of the time by the adaptations of the comic strips to animation. Crazy Cat as a comic strip is one of my all-time favorites. They've never captured that really. I mean, they had no consideration of what the original strip looked like.
There are some of the Crazy Cat films, some of the Cats and Jammer Kids films that are inspired, and some that just have a kind of workman-like feel to them. If a comic strip like Mutt and Jeff, which is syndicated in, say, over 100 newspapers, it has this kind of built-in audience already. People recognize the characters. They will go and see a Mutt and Jeff cartoon. They were done at the Raoul Barre studios, and the person responsible for drawing, animating, and directing most of the Mutt and Jeff cartoons was a man named Charles Bowers, or Charlie Bowers as we know him today.
Charlie Bowers and Raoul Barre and some of the early animators were trying to animate in a sort of a sporadic way. They hadn't really studied action very much yet. Animation was in such an early stage that nobody really related looking at real things and the way real things move and caricaturing it.
There's one Mutt and Jeff cartoon that we've preserved at Eastman House called Domestic Difficulties, which is a typical night on the town with Mutt and Jeff. They're sneaking off away from their wives to go out drinking. There's a nice little stylistic touch in it. The backgrounds do almost a 180-degree effect that takes the audience to Mutt and Jeff's drunken revelry in the park. And also, at the same time, the kind of spinning gives you a sense of their inebriation. The backgrounds are spinning around. That's a clever little device. There were probably more Mutt and Jeff cartoons made than any of the other screen adaptations of popular comic strip characters. And I think at one point, they were able to produce one a week. So it was almost the equivalent of a Sunday color supplement. Mutt and Jeff comic strip, every week you would get a new 35mm Mutt and Jeff short film.